Well, thank you, Lloyd, and members of the authority. Appreciate the opportunity to join you today. This has been an interesting ride we've been on the past couple of years. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about it. I'm going to take it kind of from a different approach than what you heard this morning. I think what you'll find out is what we've been doing over the past couple of years is really building on the shoulders of giants, as they say. And many of the folks you heard from this morning to me are the folks who are really giants in what we're trying to do here. But we're trying to kind of attack this issue from a little bit different perspective. And folks, will probably become painfully clear and obvious as I go through my presentation. Folks this morning were scientists and really hardball researchers. I'm just a simple country lawyer from northeastern Colorado who has kind of fallen into this. But I am a closet technologist, believe very, very strongly in the power of technology. And so our real question around managing carbon is, what are the technology pursuits that are in the lab? They're things that we really could see significant breakthroughs, and how do we harness those? How do we really find them, identify them, harvest them, and as you heard this morning, the challenge of taking them to scale, the challenge of solving new regulatory paradigms. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit this morning. Let's get this puppy to run. We've got a I don't know, Lloyd, if the battery's dead or if it's operator error, very possibly operator error. While we're getting capable operator help here, Tri-State, and I'll just jump to Tri-State for a minute. Now I don't feel so bad. So let me, and I'll zoom through a couple of the introductory slides and we'll come back to it as necessary. Tri-State is a wholesale power supplier to distribution cooperatives and power districts in 4 states, Nebraska, Colorado, New Mexico, and Wyoming. We have a huge footprint in Wyoming, so the economy of Wyoming is very central and dear to us, and certainly the natural resources that Wyoming has, the ability to move those resources into commercial deployment and keep those competitive into the future is in our interest, and that's what we want to do. Okay. Anyhow, we are a consumer-owned, not-for-profit power supplier, and that's maybe an important subtext to this, because I'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about why different utilities are taking different strategies and how they respond to carbon. But as a not-for-profit entity, whatever dollar we get hit with in any regulatory charge goes directly to those $1.5 million at the end of the line, directly to those businesses who provide jobs, to those folks at the end of the line across those 200,000 square miles. So our mission isn't about some remote shareholders and shareholder return. Our mission is about the affordability of our product to our end-use consumers. And so that puts us in a very different position, as I'll go into in a few minutes, compared to some of our colleagues in the industry. Just to give you a feel for us on our scale, that footprint is huge, but relatively speaking, we're not a big utility. We're not a Southern company. As you heard about this morning, our colleagues at Southern Company, we're a fraction of their size. We're what we call a mid-tier 2. We do have an operating statement about $1.3 billion a year. Not insignificant, but not substantial to take on big research projects of the scale you heard this morning. The other thing about it is that as a not-for-profit, we don't have a regulatory model where we go to regulators to get a return. Again, it's these folks at the end of the line. Some of you know, I got to put a shout out not only to the board, but James Schaefer, and just as by way of admission, JM was CEO of Tri-State when I hired on. I don't know if he counts that as good or bad. We'll see after this about how that goes. But JM really positioned Tri-State to be in spite of the fact of our size, he positioned Tri-State to be a real strategic player. And that's fundamentally why I'm here. It's fundamentally why we're pursuing these as the groundwork that JM did in setting us up as a strategic player. So as we go forward, we were formed almost 62 years ago by these cooperatives and power districts. Could you go back one slide, please? By these power districts to manage resources on their behalf. We have to mitigate risk. They came together and formed the G&Ts to provide their wholesale power and to mitigate risk. So we marshal those resources, again, $4.6 billion worth of assets across that 200,000 square miles. But we really are formed to do that for them. Our member systems who provide the retail service to the end of the line to the folks who provide those jobs in rural areas, they simply can't take on the risks of this industry. And we've done a very good job of that. That's why we were formed 62 years ago. I think if you go to the next slide, and if you look at the whole issue of carbon challenge, the carbon management risk that we face going forward, I would say that the G&T model, us being formed to manage the risk on behalf of our members and their member owners at the end of the line, it's even more pervasive today. And so if you think about carbon risk, you've heard a little bit about it this morning. You've got some panels coming up, certainly Dr. Friedman, who will talk about it a little bit later. The challenges that we face, and the panel this afternoon that we'll discuss with Tom Dennis, the real issues that are emerging in carbon management. We've been facing this for a handful of years. You go back about 5 or 6 years, about the time JM retired as CEO of Tri-State, we were facing a big challenge at that time, the seeming inevitability of some carbon mitigation, some carbon regulation. That died off for a couple of years. Now, of course, as you'll hear this afternoon, with the new source performance standards that EPA now has on the books for new power plants, and this summer in June, the anticipated existing source performance standards for carbon. That really is changing the landscape substantially. So as we looked at it, even 4 or 5 years ago, we were worried about that cost of carbon. We did a carbon footprint study. We evaluated what our options were, and based on the carbon mitigate or management structure, whether it's cap and trade or whether it's a carbon tax, we were facing at least a forecast of $20 to $40 a ton. At $20 to $40 a ton, that would hit our bottom line an additional $200 to $400 million a year. That's on top of a $1.3 billion operating statement. So the costs and the impacts and the risk to rural Colorado, to rural Wyoming, rural Nebraska, and rural New Mexico were pretty substantial. So we needed to figure out what do we do about that if we face that in the future. The other thing that we're worried about is policy is getting ahead of technology. If we have the opportunity to develop technology and then have policy come in and surround that, I think we'd be in a better picture. But as you'll hear this afternoon, we tend to have policy outstripping technology. And that puts us in a very difficult position because a technology play that may work for one utility with their business model may be absolutely wrong for a utility with a different business model. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Next slide. To amplify on that point a little bit, a lot of utilities have tried to, and then legitimately gone to addressing this carbon issue by going to fuel switching. That's a good strategy if you've got aged plants that are going to have far more capital invested in them, if they're depreciated on your books so that you're not earning a return on the investment for your shareholders, and if you really do have the opportunity to move to with a fuel clause adjustment or pass-through mechanism so that any risk of fuel can be moved off of your shoulders. And that's not a criticism of an investor-owned utility, sorry Kyle, If I were to provide a strategy to an investor-owned utility, that's exactly the strategy I would advise them of. But for us as a not-for-profit, with the age of our fleet, with the capital investment in our fleet, and the controls our board has invested in the fleet ahead of regulatory requirements, we've got 30 years left on those plants. As the question came up to the panel earlier this morning, why would you be putting CCS on an old plant? Well, it may look old from the outside, but those babies are new on the inside. All of our fleet have 30, with the exception of one very small plant in southwest Colorado, have more than 30 years of life expectancy ahead of them. So we simply don't have the mechanism or the wherewithal to convert a bunch of that fleet to natural gas to meet a standard. So that to us, plus the tax appetite about early retirement of the fleet, the tax benefits as a not-for-profit, we are taxable. We've got a very low tax appetite. So all of the reasons that many utilities are going to fuel switching simply doesn't work for us. So if the regulatory policy gets ahead of us and dictates fuel switching, it puts us in a bind. It puts those consumers, those 1.5 million consumers at the end of our members' lines, puts them at a real competitive disadvantage. Lloyd, next slide. So if fuel switching, as we walk through this, if we've got a carbon issue to face, I think we've got a legitimate issue to face. If fuel switching isn't the answer, then what do we do? You've heard a lot this morning, great discussion about carbon capture and sequestration. I'm not going to go into that in any depth. We've been putting research money even for a utility our size. We do make a substantial investment in R&D. We've been research participants in all of the demonstration projects around CCS through EPRI. And as part of the work with EPRI, we've come to understand CCS quite a bit. Associated with that, and we don't have it as a separate slide, but enhanced oil field recovery, as you've heard about this morning. We believe strongly in enhanced oil field recovery. Some of our largest pumping load is anthropogenic CO2. It's moving from southwest Colorado and northeast New Mexico down into Texas. Certainly there's a huge EOR play here in Wyoming, a very good EOR play in Colorado. We're a 24% owner member of Basin Electric. We've got the Dry Forks, not Dry Forks, I'll come back to that in a minute. Dakota Gasification is taking pure CO2, 96% pure CO2, piping it to Saskatchewan for enhanced oil field recovery. So we think there's a huge future for oil field recovery, but we're not convinced that CCS by itself, CCS plus EOR by itself, is really going to be the answer that we need for the future. So as we looked at this and we thought a lot of people are doing a lot of big stuff, what's an alternative approach? How could we go about trying to come up with a different model for solving this carbon management issue? Lloyd, next slide, please. I love it when the director has to respond to me. That's really great. Thanks, Lloyd. Keep up the good work. Before I get into this, I do want to say one thing. If you like this panel this morning, and because of the work we've been doing here, I've chased these panels all over the country and around the globe. I got to tell you, the agenda that Lloyd and the WIA board put together today is absolutely world class. So small and Mark Mills, Lloyd. So anyhow, as we go forward, we need to think about how we advance and foster innovation in this space. Can we make, as a small company relative to Southern, we can't make hundreds of millions of dollars of bets. We, under JM's watch, when we were developing the Holcomb Power Plant potential in southwest Kansas, we took a very small CO2 slipstream off of Holcomb 1, took it out to some algae tubes, some tubes with algae, got it through beta, got it through the test environment, the lipids, fats, tested out, the great feedstock. And what happened? Western Kansas windstorm came along and blew the thing over. The company then went to Italy, got a big contract, went bankrupt. So there we bet on the wrong technology for the power plant, and we bet on the wrong company. At $1.3 billion, we simply can't make those bets. So we had to think about a different way to try and harvest some research and harvest some technology innovation. Next slide, please. This is a slide from D&B Chemo. Many of you know of them. They've given us the opportunity to reuse it. I was thinking about using CO2 in a different way. What are the pathways for using CO2 and really creating carbon as an asset and using CO2, the output of a power plant, could be a coal plant, could be a gas plant, the output of an industrial complex. We all in the fossil consumptive industries face a carbon managed future. So what we wanted to do, what are the ways that we could reuse CO2 out of an industrial complex, create some value, and create some economic value that helps drive down the cost of the overall capture and separation that we need to do. And you heard about that this morning, this issue about, a lot of issues about how you move from a test site into demonstration, into commercialization. There's all of those curves that we have to think about. But then there's the other issue about how do we get a lot of players to the table so that we don't have to bet on one technology, we don't have to bet on one company. And that's not to say that we would disagree with any of the research and work that the folks you heard from this morning are doing. Thank you, Wayne. We support that immensely. If we were to develop the Holcomb plant in Kansas, that is one of the two now that's left under the new source review as a potential candidate to go forward under new source review with a more favorable regulatory, carbon regulatory treatment. You'll hear a little bit about that this afternoon. We're going to have to do probably something big. So we'll learn from them that. This is not to say those aren't some of the right answers. But we've got this existing fleet that we have to look at. And if you think about Wyoming, the amount of PBR coal that goes to other places, think about the places, even though we've got, take EOR from them, we've got great EOR potential in Wyoming, Colorado, Montana. There are places where PBR coal out of Wyoming goes to that have no EOR play. So what are the opportunities for doing something beyond EOR? So you hear us use that term, beyond EOR. That's not to say EOR isn't great, we should use it, we should use it for as much of a bridge strategy as we can, but we need to think about different plays. So to kind of get our arms around if there is some future for some play beyond EOR, what did we need to know about it? So we syndicated some research to take a look at a couple of things, take a look at the folks who are doing something novel in capture and recycling. Many that were on the Lindo curve this morning that you saw, the big rainbow curve, and then who was doing different stuff on capture and recycling and reuse. So let's take a minute, and this is what I call applied research. We just went out, found who was doing something that had public information available, that was doing something different in innovation for carbon capture. When we first started down this path, we had some discussions with folks who were doing the big plumbing, if you will, on the back of power plants. And we ran this proposition by them about reuse. And they said, well, yeah, go play with the reuse. We've got this capture and separation settled. And I asked them, I said, well, is bolting hundreds of millions of dollars on the back of every power plant, every industrial complex in the world, is that the answer? Or do we need a breakthrough? And so we really think we need to have a mechanism to try and find that portfolio of those breakthroughs, those things that are in the garage, they're in the lab, they're being tested at very small scale. How do we get a breakthrough with us? We did this syndicated research just to satisfy ourselves that we thought there was something here. The other syndicated research that we wanted to do, who's doing something unique in recycling? You know, square miles of algae fields wasn't the answer for us. So we were worried about what do we do? Is there something out there that we could really go after? And if we did it, how would we do it? So we went, and again, this is operational research, going out finding who's doing what out there. This is a little data now. There's 136 some odd companies that are doing different things in these fields of reuse of CO2. So we thought, okay, there are 90, 100 doing something novel in capture and separation. There's another 136 that are doing something that's novel on the reuse of CO2. So what do we do with that? There are plenty of these folks out there, but they're at very small scale. I hope I don't offend anybody, but I had a scientist come in and say, we've got the solution to your CO2 problem. I said, oh, what's that? So he walked us through it and said, well, what does it produce? Well, baking soda. And so I said, have you taken that baking soda concept to utility scale? And he kind of shook his head and he said, well, no. I said, well, what would you have? He said, well, we'd have mountains of baking soda. I asked him, literally, straight up, what are we going to do with mountains of baking soda? And the response was, I guess we could tarp them. Well, to me, tarp and baking soda probably isn't the answer. So we've got to figure out which of those reuses have the ability to have a market at utility scale. So that's the other side of this. How do we get breakthroughs in capture and separation, radical breakthroughs? How do we get radical breakthroughs in reuse? And then how do we deploy and develop markets? So commercialization is really the critical next element that we wanted to look at. So we did some more syndicated research trying to find out what would happen. And for us in the utility industry, when we've got a power plant that's permitted, we don't like to mess with that too much. We want to be sure that we don't have anything happen to that plant that puts our stack, puts us under new source review. There's just a lot of things as a utility that you don't want to do. So what we were finding is that at the scale we were talking about, we weren't finding anything anywhere in the world that had what we needed as a platform to really test out these new opportunities for capture and separation, these new opportunities for reuse and for market scale. So we did more syndicated research. And what we wanted to do there, and as you see, we tried to look at it across from a matrix perspective, single technologies, multiple technologies along the x-axis, y-axis, multiple integrated platforms, and single platforms. And I characterize what you heard this morning were either multiple technologies and single platform, or multiple platforms and single technologies. Going all the way to a test center that could do all of the stuff that we wanted to do across, from pre-combustion to combustion to post-combustion, from fuel handling clear through to in-use and post-combustion power plant. We just don't have anything like that. You heard this discussion in Southern this morning. I'll talk about that in a minute. Great platform that's testing capture and separation at a very small scale. We need to step that scale up substantially if it's going to move in the time frames that we think we need it to move to get to utility scale. And then it's nothing other than EOR and a few other byproducts. There's nothing that's really systematically trying to go after a very comprehensive level of reuse. So we wanted to think about how we could develop this kind of at the bottom line here, an end-to-end carbon utilization center as kind of a cornerstone for going forward. Certainly this leverages off of the work that was done, as you heard from Southern Company this morning. We really are deeply involved with them in what they're doing at Berry, what they're doing at the National Carbon Capture Center. As we've talked with Roger and Steve and our colleagues, that's a natural feedstock to what we're talking about doing at a higher scale and across that multiple technologies and multiple platforms. So we really think this is additive and very complementary to what's out there now. It's not a supplemental approach. Again, more detail on the NCCC. Again, a great test bed for what it's doing. And again, this is one of those areas where we think we're building on the shoulders and standing on the shoulders of giants. So if you think about from an integrated test center basis, what does that mean? And when we did the syndicated research, we posited, and up at the top here, we had the actual name of one of our power plants involved. But we stepped back from that and said, if we're going to do this integrated energy test center, that would go everything from fuel handling and pre-combustion to post-combustion and to reuse, what would that look like? And so we've actually done a lot of engineering evaluation at one of our power plants to say, what would it take to do that? And I'll come back to those numbers in a minute. But I think this is the picture of what we believe we need to develop somewhere in the United States or somewhere in the world. When we started on this, we looked around a lot, our due diligence, trying to find a place that we could take some of these new technologies to bolt them on, and we simply didn't find them to move above the scale of what was coming out of the PC4 and the National Carbon Capture Center. So we need to have something that goes to that utility scale. We'll talk about what that utility scale means to us in a minute. We also wanted to test it out with the folks who are doing a lot in this space. So we went out to a lot of universities with their technology transfer offices, posed the notion about what they're doing at the university level. Would they do, first off, do they know of any test center environment that this could happen? How would they participate? And they all wrote us back letters with wet signatures. These weren't emails back saying this is an interesting comment. These were 24 major universities, institutions who wrote back with a wet signature saying, we need this for what we're doing. And certainly the labs were involved as well. As we've been talking about with our colleagues in Wyoming, obviously you heard this morning from the good professor about the work at University of Wyoming, Wyoming Community Colleges. We do think there's a substantial role for education, educational institutions associated with this. And early on, we wanted to validate our process and what we were thinking about this process. And if we couldn't have gotten traction in the tech transfer world of the universities, that would have given us pause to think about whether this is really something that has potential or not. So then you've got the real issue, the fourth syndicated research in this is, as you take these very small, nascent technologies and you think about what it takes to ramp them to utility scale, what are lessons learned from other industries where you've had that maturity curve to build to market scale? So it isn't really a roadmap of doing it, it's saying, here's how other industries have done it. What can we learn from it? And do we think that we've got the ability to take these different elements and get them to utility scale? So that was our fourth syndicated research that just came off the press. Now, associated with all this, there's this concept I mentioned earlier. As a utility at our size, we can't pick a winner, try and pick a winner and loser. We just don't have enough money to do that. So we started looking for a different research model. There's two things. One, we can't pick winners and losers. And if you look at the traditional research timeline that we have and talk to folks associated with this, to get to those very robust breakthroughs and to get them to utility scale, we were hearing things like 20 years. And as you're hearing this afternoon, in terms of what the EPA will probably propose for existing source performance standards, we don't have 20 years. We don't know what that number is, but we don't have 20 years. So what we wanted to do is find a mechanism where we could get competition and collaboration together to bring researchers together to try and find solutions and to try and find those breakthroughs. And if you go back, what we came across is the notion of inducement prizes. How many of you have heard of inducement prizes, or specifically the X Prize? Yeah, good number. And so as we started into this, our partner at Holcomb, Sunflower G&T, brought a company to us who had deep connections into X Prize. We said, look, we don't want to talk to X Prize. We want to do due diligence about this inducement prize model. First off, do we think that model will work and fit for us? And secondly, if we like that model, then who do we partner with to go forward? So we went through that. We evaluated all of the folks that are doing different kinds of inducement prizes, looked at their models and thought it was the kind of thing that we could put some money into. An inducement prize, you're betting on a portfolio of competitors, head-to-head, going after the same prize. So you set a rule, what in X Prize parlance is a rule set. You have them under head-to-head competition for a period of time, and if one of them crosses the finish line, they get this prize purse. We'll talk about that in a minute. So as we look at it, these inducement prizes are really a way to focus the research in an area to try and get substantial breakthroughs. So we did that evaluation and came to the conclusion that an inducement prize model was better for us to try and promote the incremental research. Making that bet on a company, that bet on technology. We wanted to bet on a portfolio, but bet on that portfolio where they're competing head to head. So that's what, in the simplest terms, that's what an inducement prize model is about. What you do with an inducement prize model, you post a prize purse. That money's not at risk unless somebody wins several years down the road. So you post that prize purse, and that whets people's appetite. That gets their focus. They look at that and they say, we ought to think about competing for this. But if you've stated your proposition correctly, your value proposition, at the end of the day, they really aren't competing for that prize purse. What are they competing for? That new market, that future market share, that carbon management world that's worth literally billions of dollars. It's not worth a $10 million prize purse, a $30 million prize purse. But you use the prize purse to get their attention. So we went through that, came to the conclusion that inducement prize is what we wanted to pursue, came to the conclusion through our due diligence that X Prize Foundation was the best game in town. Now, if you think about it, up to this point, everything I've said is, you look at Tri-State and say, gee, Tri-State, why you? Well, we've got this issue. We aren't big enough to carry this ourselves. We had to find a partner that could bring some gravitas to it, for lack of a better term. And we thought the X Prize Foundation was certainly that entity. Now, if you look at the board of directors of X Prize and you look at the board of directors of Tri-State, you look up and say, how in the world could these two groups ever come together? Very different views of the world. But they loved the fact that we were not for profit. In fact, it started that we would sell electricity and not do it for a profit. That started. So they liked that model, but they also liked what we were trying to do to break this research model open. And they also, as part of their desire for things, is to change the regulatory framework. They agreed with us that policy was being set ahead of technology, so we had to do something to bootstrap technology so it could help direct and influence policy. So we entered into some effort with the X Prize Foundation. This is just more background about it. But it's that fundamental issue that in the X Prize for the Ansari, this is the 100 kilometers into space. You got to do it 2 times within 2 weeks. That launch commercial space. How many are familiar with Spaceport, Sir Richard Branson, Virgin Galactic down in New Mexico? He was a loser in this, but he bought out the winner's technology, and that's how it's a spaceport in New Mexico, which, small world, we provide power to. But that was a $10 million prize purse, but it brought in $100 million worth of research because they were going after that market. They weren't going after the $10 million. Now, what's in it for X Prize? X Prize doesn't get any intellectual property off of this. We, as sponsors, funders, would not get any intellectual property. But X Prize, we get the cost of the affordability of our product being maintained in the future. So that's our value proposition. X Prize's value proposition are these billions of media impressions. That's how they exist. It's on media impressions. So that's what they're going for. So whatever you bring to the table that they're going to participate in and support, they've got to think it's got to be big. And they think this one is big in the development we've done with them. Talked a little bit about this. When we met with X Prize, and we have re-engaged with X Prize, now that we've had some developments on the funding side, a couple of years ago we engaged with X Prize to actually work with us, bring in the international experts to help design a rule set around this. And they've got the ability through their connections to bring in world-class researchers, scientists, technologists, and political types, you name it, they bring them in. And so we sat down and we talked about what we wanted to accomplish. And so our draft rule set came up that said at 1 to 4 megawatts equivalent, as a competitor, 1 to 4 megawatts equivalent, you operate for a year, you have to remove 80% of the CO2 out of coal plant slipstream, limited amounts of water, limited amounts of power consumption, and a market that has utility scale on the back end, the reuse. So if you meet those things, that would be the rule set of how you could actually then compete for that $10 million prize purse. So we developed that a couple of years ago, and then we went into funding. We're now at a point where we want to refresh that. So we're actually finalizing our contract with X Prize as we speak to have them go in another round of bringing all the experts together, reevaluating how have the technologies moved in the marketplace, given what these big platforms are bringing to the table. Do we still need this? So we're in this re-inspection of the need and then how it would be designed for us to move forward. That'll be a couple month, 3-month process. In the meantime, if we close funding, then they would be in a position to do what they call a launch, to launch this process. Now think about the process. We've got literally hundreds of people, hundreds of entities that are doing something unique in reuse of carbon dioxide. We've got literally more than 100 that are doing something unique in carbon capture and separation. So they would have designed with us a process where we would bring all of those folks together, and through a competitive process, you would narrow that down to the point where you would have about 5 that you would take out and actually have a bay at a power plant with a slipstream from a power plant, taking that 1 to 4 megawatts equivalent, getting up their process, and demonstrating their wares. So we'd have this using XPRIZE to help winnow down these literally hundreds and hundreds of competitors down to that handful that would actually go out and bolt onto a power plant to try and prove out their business proposition. So it's a pretty daunting process, but we think it's one that has a great potential. And if you think about the history of these inducement prizes, the people that win them are the people that everybody would have said beforehand aren't the ones that are going to win. The longitudinal prize out of 1798, we kept losing our seaways, our ships and our seamen, and the European community got together and said, we need a prize to create better longitudinal navigation. The guy who won it wasn't a seafarer, it was a clockmaker. Everybody said, no, put away clockmaker. How many have heard of Charles Lindbergh? Charles Lindbergh was called a fool. He would never do it. All the aeronautical folks were betting against him. Who's the guy who won? Charles Lindbergh. So we have belief that the inducement prize model and this mechanism will get us breakthroughs that we can't design today. And that's fundamentally what we're after. Our real issue here is how do we take CO2 and change the perception and look at CO2 as an asset. We need to create value. Many of you are in the oil and gas business. The gas business had a terrible byproduct, benzene. Figured out how to make money out of it. We've got a byproduct, CO2. Our proposition is how do we figure out how to make money out of it. And so to that, our board set us on a goal to post a $10 million prize purse and post $2 million toward the first opportunity to build out a test center to move this forward. This is just a series of steps we've been in. As I mentioned, we're now in a refresh mode with the XPRIZE Foundation. A series of Canadian industrial participants have come together and we're putting $14 million into the initiative. We're talking with many others. But at the end of the day, I think one of the things, even if you think that prize model and a few people tying into a bay and competing head-to-head isn't going to give you a solution, we still need an integrated energy test center that would do things at this scale. We don't have that anywhere in the country, anywhere in the world. And so that, I think, is the real opportunity, is how do we build a kind of integrated test center that can take what's coming out of the NCCCs, coming out of the laboratories, and take them to utility scale. As you heard this morning, this scale issue is big. So the first phase of the prize is 1 to 4 megawatt equivalent. Our objective then would be to take the best of the best, take them to 10 to 40 megawatt equivalent, prove that up for a couple of years, and then potentially inside of 7 years, we're at 100 to 400 megawatt equivalent, which is, of course, what we would need to do if we're going to meet what the potential standards are that are coming out of the existing standard rulemaking this summer. So it's a big, hairy, audacious goal, but we simply don't think we have the ability to pick those winners and losers. We need a mechanism to find out who those winners and losers could be. We think competition in this space would be very valuable. We think that would give us the breakthrough. But we also really need this test center concept where we can bolt on and test out a lot of things. Many of us have talked about EOR. EOR, CO2 out of a power plant for EOR, we have to have a breakthrough there. We've got to be able to take that 12% CO2, get it to 96% grade so we can get it into viable EOR plant. So we need some work there. Our proposition is, well, let's put this little X Prize thing over here with 5 bays, and then let's build out a test center that has other bays where you could go out and test out other issues. So that's the pursuit we're under, we're embarked upon. Maybe a big hairy audacious goal, but as we used to say out on the ranch, keep digging long enough, we're going to find a pony, and we think there's a pony in here somewhere. So with that, I'll conclude. Be delighted to take any questions. Appreciate the opportunity, Lloyd, to meet with you and the board, have the discussions we've had with your colleagues in Wyoming about the potential here.